Hello, everyone, and welcome to the OFA webinar, Adult Literacy and Education, Strategies to Alleviate the Literacy Gap. I'm going to turn things over to our moderator, James Butler, Family Assistance Program Specialist for the Office of Family Assistance. James?
Hello, everyone, and welcome again to today's webinar. As Steve mentioned, Adult Literacy and Education, Strategies to Alleviate the Literacy Gap. We have a great panel of expert presenters to discuss this topic with you today. Again, my name is James Butler. I am with the Office of Family Assistance in the Administration for Children and Families, and I will serve as your facilitator for today's webinar. During this webinar, national level policymakers and researchers will share with you a comprehensive overview of the current literacy gap in the U.S. in terms of national programs, initiatives, and research. They will also explain the relationship between adult education and workforce development and give some general examples of strategies organizations can pursue to close the national adult literacy gap in their communities. In addition to explaining the trends and urgency related to adult literacy and education in the U.S., our discussion will highlight the development, progress, and impact of two programs that effectively provide adult education in their clients. So today's webinar, we're hoping our objective in today's webinar is that you will get a better understanding of some of the emerging trends and current context surrounding adult literacy and basic education among TANF and low-income populations in the United States. Learn about some ways to identify service strategies to maintain, implement, and strengthen adult basic education and literacy programs at the local, state, and regional level, as well as explore lessons learned and best practices from programs that have successfully incorporated adult literacy and basic education components in the services they provide. I want to take a few minutes now to explain how to use GoToWebinar for those of you who may be joining us for the first time. In the upper right corner of your screen, you'll find the control panel. You can minimize or enlarge the control panel by clicking on the orange arrow. By expanding the control panel, you can scroll to the bottom to type any questions you may have and provide responses to our polling questions, which will come up during the course of the webinar. You can enter your questions throughout the webinar, and if you like, you may indicate who you'd like to direct that question to so that we can respond to your questions. And we will monitor your questions and address them during the Q&A session. As mentioned, we will launch several polls throughout the presentation, and you can respond to them by clicking on the radio button next to your preferred response. We'll leave each poll up for about 30 seconds before moving forward. We're delighted to have a variety of presenters for you today. You'll first hear from Dr. Daphne Greenberg. Dr. Greenberg is a distinguished university professor in the Educational Psychology program at Georgia State University. Her research focus is on adults who struggle with reading. She has published on various aspects of adult literacy, including health literacy, family literacy, reading components, and reading interventions. She currently serves as the principal investigator of the Center for the Study of Adult Literacy. The center seeks to improve our understanding of ways to advance the reading skills of adults who are struggling to learn to read at the 3rd to 8th grade levels. Next, you'll hear from Cheryl Keenan, who serves as the director of the U.S. Department of Education's Division of Adult Education and Literacy in the Office of Vocational and Adult Education. In her role as the national director, she oversees the office, which funds almost $600 million in state and local grant programs to enable adults to become literate and complete high school so they can succeed as workers. parents, and citizens. She's also responsible for overseeing the Office of Corrections Education and the Adult National Programs account. Following Cheryl, you'll hear from William Durden, who serves as the Policy Associate for IBEST and Pathway Development in Basic Education for Adults at the Washington State Board for Community and Technical Colleges. He's responsible for supporting and scaling up IBEST, with the ultimate goal that all adult learners will have access to innovative, high-quality education programs that provide the knowledge, skills, and credentials necessary for securing living wage employment. He has provided IBEST training and technical assistance to over 33 states. Following William, you will hear from Stacy Wedlake, who serves as research coordinator and analyst with the Technology and Social Change Group at the University of Washington Information School. After moving to Seattle in 2008, she started teaching basic digital literacy classes for adults receiving TANF and others seeking employment in a changed economy. She eventually taught entry-level technology coursework for ABE students at Seattle Community College. She seeks to better understand how digital literacy programs and other digital inclusion activities can better support individuals and communities in achieving their goals. And so now you should see before you our first polling question for the day, which I believe Steve will read out to you and wait for results.
Thanks, James. So the first polling question is, how familiar are you with the national landscape of adult literacy programs and basic education initiatives? Very familiar, somewhat unfamiliar, and very unfamiliar. So we'll give you a chance to vote on that directly on your screen, and then we will show the results. Okay, so it looks like somewhat familiar is the top response. So, but there seems to be a good dispersal of views on all four. So hopefully this webinar will provide something of use for all of you. So we look forward to getting into the first presentation, and I will turn it over to Daphne Greenberg.
Thank you very much. It's a real honor to be presenting today, and I hope to give basically just a very broad introduction to the adult literacy field. I think it'll be especially useful for about the 40% of you who really felt that you're not very familiar with it, and it should lay the context for the future speakers. So we can get started with the next slide, please. I like this definition of literacy, and I think that I will, by my going over it, you'll understand why. This definition says that it's the individual's ability to read, write, and speak in English and compute and solve problems. I like this definition because a lot of people often think of literacy as being just reading, and this definition shows us that it's a lot more. I also like it for the second part. At levels of proficiency necessary to function on the job and in society to achieve one's goals and develop one's knowledge and potential. I think sometimes when we think about adults who struggle with any kind of literacy skill, we lose sight of the fact that as adults, we all have our own goals and we all have our own needs that may differ from other adults. So, for example, I often tell my graduate students that I don't need to know how to read and understand a physics journal. I only need to know how to read and understand an educational psychology journal. So I'm not going to join a class that's going to teach me about physics. And if I find myself in that class by accident, I'm going to leave. And we really need to think about that in terms of our adults who come to adult literacy programs or who you may interact with, who you think may benefit from adult literacy classes. Okay, next slide, please. To give you a little bit of a context, there's an international adult literacy survey called the PIAC, and in our country, only 14% of adults would be considered proficient in literacy. Only 10% would be considered proficient in numeracy. Only 6% would be considered proficient in problem solving in technology rich environments. That's basically, for example, using the computer, the internet, etc. And there's going to be, the last speaker, I think, is going to be talking more about that. And then on the flip side, so we have a very low percentage of us that are considered proficient, and what I would consider pretty high percentage of us are at very low levels. 19% are at low levels of literacy, 29% at low levels of numeracy, and a whopping 62% of us are at low levels of problem solving in technology-rich environments. Next slide, please. And there are a lot of consequences, both for individuals and for society, in terms of low literacy that people may or may not consider. And of course, this really depends on the individual, but they could have problems at the workplace, with medical information, helping their children with homework, especially as their children get older. And low literacy has implications for society in terms of a lower tax base, higher health costs, lower productivity, and then the intergenerational transfer of literacy. Next slide, please. Sometimes people may have some stereotypes about who are adults who struggle with reading. And it's really a very, very varied group. I like to point out that a lot of adults who have difficulty with literacy are employed. They could be high school graduates. That's often a shocker, and I'll get back to that a little bit later. They could be recent high school dropouts, non-English speakers, prison inmates, parents, et cetera, et cetera. But I do like to stress that it is a very heterogeneous group. Next slide, please. People who have difficulty with literacy skills don't wear a sign saying, hey, I have difficulty with literacy. And for those of you who work in organizations such as social service agencies or organizations that just deal with clients in general, you may hear things or see things that might alert you that, oh, maybe I'm dealing with somebody who has low literacy skills. For example, they come to fill out a job application, and then all of a sudden they say, well, I don't really have time to complete this, or I hurt my hand, can you fill this out for me? I forgot my glasses, can you read this to me? Or behaviors, you give them a form and they just leave, or they don't respond to mailed information. Next slide, please. I'm going to switch over now a little bit. So now that you have a little bit of an understanding, I'm going to switch over to more in terms of the educational aspects. So adults who struggle with reading or numeracy often attend adult literacy programs with many different goals. As I list here, they could have functional goals, spiritual goals, pleasure, family, job, economic advancement goals. And it's really important to try to keep those goals in mind because, as I said, adults, with children, K through 12, until the age of 16, they have to attend no matter what, right, classes. But adults don't. And if they don't feel that the program is going to meet their need, they're going to leave. And so it's very important to try to keep goals in mind. Next slide, please. There are also different types of instruction both that meet the needs and goals of adults who have very different needs and skill levels. So, for example, for adults who need to learn how to speak English, there are English language acquisition classes. For those who have, let's say, below the middle school level of literacy skills, there's basic skills, functional skills classes. Then there's more of like the middle school kind of level. Then there's the high school equivalency level. And then there are levels for adults who actually make it into technical colleges or community colleges, and they need more developmental or remedial help in order to succeed in the post-secondary environment. Next slide, please. And then there are different approaches to instruction, family literacy, workplace literacy, and so forth. We don't have time to go into that today, but I did want to let you know that there are different approaches. Next slide, please. They're also located in many, many different sites, such as I already mentioned the technical community colleges, work sites, libraries, prisons, housing projects, etc. Next slide, please. And adults who attend adult literacy programs often give insight into the different needs they have. So, for example, one person may say, I now understand the social studies facts that my 8th grader is learning, or I can understand advanced graphs and tables. I can create and follow a simple budget for the first time. Next slide, please. I want to just focus a little bit on reading for a moment because that is my area, and to show how complex it is to teach different skills. So, for example, reading, as you can see, involves a lot of underlying skills, whether it's comprehension, background knowledge, vocabulary, word recognition, etc. And not only do we need to work on the individual skills, but we also have to work on getting them to be automatic and fluid and integrated so that people can read effortlessly and understand what they're reading. Next slide, please. And adults have lots of different needs, as I've already alluded to, but these are the kind of some of the academic needs, such as decoding, comprehension, oral language, math, writing, et cetera, et cetera. And then there's also a lot of non-academic issues, which I will get into in a moment. Next slide, please. Just to give you an example of what it means if you have low literacy skills and how it can affect a different kind of underlying skill that we need for reading. I once did a study where we tested adults who are reading between the 3rd and the 5th grade levels, and we asked them a whole bunch of background information and a whole lot of reasoning kinds of questions. And so an example of a background question was, how many weeks are in a year? And only 11% of our students knew that answer. And for this kind of question, some lobsters are red. Tony has a lobster. Is it red? Only 20% were able to answer that question accurately. And the reason why this is important is because we need to understand that it's not just a matter of learning the, how to read a word and maybe how to understand what one reads, but you also need a lot of background knowledge in order to make sense of the text that's presented in front of you. And you also have to know how to reason, because as you read more and more complex text, the reasoning skills that are needed are very essential. Now, it's also important to realize that adults who've been out of school for a very, very long time may have difficulty with that kind of reasoning question because they're not used to answering those kinds of questions anymore, because clearly that's a very kind of academic or a school kind of question. It's not a question that we, typically encounter on the street. Nobody's going to come up to me and say, some lobsters are red. Tony has a lobster. Is it red? Right? That's only the kind of thing that I would see in school. But it's important for our students because they are taking all kinds of tests eventually that will have questions like this. And so it's important to not only teach the skills, but also teach the testing and questioning kinds of things that they're going to be exposed to. Next slide, please. So once again, I just really want to hit upon the different ways that our students are different. I've mentioned some of these already. There's age, right? Somebody, if they can be as young as 16 if they're not attending high school, and as old as 99 or older, obviously. Language backgrounds can differ, how far they went up to high school, their familiarity with computers, etc. Next slide, please. So to make it more real, I just wanted to share with you a little bit about demographics from a recent study that I conducted with adults who are reading at the 3rd to the 8th grade levels. You'll see their age was quite varied, and what I want to point out actually is the red on this slide. So when you have non-native English speakers in adult literacy programs, just like you do in K through 12, they can represent many, many, many different languages, and that can create all kinds of problems in terms and difficulties in terms of helping non-native English speakers navigate through systems. Next slide, please. 23% reported having a high school diploma. Now, this was a sample of about 500 students who read between the 3rd and the 8th grade level. And so I just wanted to stress that once again, that even if you graduate from high school, you may be reading at very low levels. And I think that that's important for those of you who, once again, work in social service agencies, that asking your client whether or not they have a high school diploma may or may not be an accurate measure of their academic skills. Also, I think the last bullet is an interesting one, that there's obviously, whether it's genetic or environmental, we don't know, but 17% had family members who had problems learning to read as well. And that's something for those of you who are interested in families, you may want to consider when you interact with a parent or a child who has reading or numeracy issues. Next slide, please. I think that this slide has some interesting information. So 91% of my participants said that keeping a regular schedule is important to them, but only 23% said that they can keep the same schedule every week, and 15% said that unexpected things happened often that interfered with their schedule, and in fact 12% had to change or cancel an appointment once a week because of unexpected situations. And I think that that's something that we all need to keep in mind when our students or clients don't come to an appointment or cancel the appointment at the last second, that many of them do seem to have a lot of things in their lives that get in the way of doing what they want to do. And it's not that they don't have the motivation, right? 91% said that keeping a regular schedule is important, but many of them had difficulty doing so. Next slide, please. I want to just alert you to that second bullet that I think is important. About almost 25% said that they often or always avoid reading material that looks too difficult for them. So that's something I think that's really important for adult literacy teachers to keep in mind, that you want to make sure that the material that's given to students is at the right level. Not just from an instructional per se point of view, but also from a motivational point of view. If something looks too difficult, they're not even going to bother trying to read it. And so at least, a quarter of them won't try. And so I think it's very important to start off with easier tasks, get the trust of the student, and then slowly provide them with harder and harder reading tasks. Next slide, please. I'm very quickly going to go over the next two slides because someone later is going to talk about digital literacy. But our students reading at the 3rd to the 8th grade level obviously had strengths in terms of using the computer. Next slide. But they also had weaknesses. And I think this is very important, especially since so much now is on the internet and applications need to be filled, and doctor appointments are done through the internet, et cetera, et cetera. So we really need to hone in on teaching digital literacy to our clientele, because even if they can read and write and do numeracy tasks on a high level, if they don't have the digital literacy skills, they're going to have great difficulties. Next slide, please. So before I move to one other area, which is the health area, I want to summarize some key points. We do know that adults can improve their skills regardless what their age is. That's the great news. The sad news for some people is that learning takes time. We don't have this magic that we could do abracadabra and somebody now goes from the 3rd grade to the 10th grade level. It takes time. Explicit instruction is important. We can't just expose people to things. We need to explicitly teach. We need to remember that many of our learners attend, then stop attending, but they do come back or they go to a different location. It's not like they're dropping out permanently. And they often stop because there are all kinds of other issues involved that could be a whole other webinar, such as childcare, transportation, work, housing, and all kinds of other issues. Next slide, please. We know that teaching adults can be difficult because they have splinter skills and a lot of demographic differences, but it's not too late to focus on basic foundations they can learn. But we have to keep their interest levels in mind. Next slide, please. We also know that reading comprehension is difficult to teach because of all the background knowledge and a lot of other skills involved. That first bullet about Kindles, I just wanted to share that we were very pleased to see that you can give technology out to people and they will return them. Also, in terms of technology, that all adult literacy programs, some with a little bit more work, but they can provide an internet-friendly place for an interactive web-based program. Adults have different ways of interacting with intelligent tutoring systems, so it's really important that you don't just flop an adult in front of a computer and say, go for it. That there are going to be individual differences with how adults go through the program, and that's going to have implications in terms of their gains. Next slide, please. And you can also rig the computer system so that they feel like they are getting a lot of that they're getting questions that they can answer, and that they're not getting a lot of negative feedback. So in my time remaining, I do want to just quickly talk about one other area that might be of interest to some of you in terms of health insurance. It's not a topic that's typically talked about, but it's very specialized, complicated, and confusing. And if you see, like, for example, 88% of adults can't calculate their share of costs for health insurance from a table. Most insurance offers are primarily online, and we already talked about the difficulty of online for many of our students. Next slide, please. Only 12% of individuals with employer-sponsored insurance have proficient health literacy, so they're going to have all kinds of difficulties in terms of understanding insurance, selecting the best insurance, knowing what they have to pay for in terms of emergency room or office visits, prescription drugs, their deductibles. Next slide, please. And low-wage earners, especially, are known to have low health information seeking skills or knowledge, and also have low digital skills to access online information about health insurance. Next slide, please. So what do you do? And I think that this can, not only for those of you involved in the health field, but those of you who are involved in any kind of helping field, it's best to explain information face-to-face rather than giving people information to read. And when you do that, it's best to use everyday terminology. So, for example, in one study, it was shown that 100% of the people that were interviewed preferred the word doctor over primary care provider or healthcare professional. Next slide, please. Documents, and once again, this is true for any field, should focus on a few main points. using common terminology, simple math, meaningful visuals. Headings and bullets should be used. There should be enough white space, simple font, short sentences, and active voice should be used. Next slide, please. My last slide focuses on just some general do's and don'ts, no matter what area you're in. So if you recognize that somebody has difficulty with reading or math or digital literacy, and you want to talk to them about that, or they talk to you about it, first of all, it's really important to be matter of fact about it. Don't act surprised. Even if they can't do the most simplest thing, it's really important to be matter of fact. Emphasize that others have the same difficulties. If you go back to that those first few slides when I showed how many people in our country have elementary literacy, numeracy, and digital skills. So obviously there are many other people in the same boat as the person you're talking to. Reading difficulties don't constitute a crisis, at least not necessarily for the person you're talking to. They could be 50 years old. They've lived all of their adult life functioning at the level that they're functioning at. They now just, for whatever reason, want to improve their skills, but it's not necessarily a crisis. And it's not up to us to suggest that a person needs to improve his or her reading or math or skills or so forth. For example, if somebody said to me, I needed to improve my physics skills, I'd say, no way, I don't need to. It's the same thing with the people that we interact with. It has to come from that person because that person has a specific goal or reason for wanting to improve their skills. And the next slide, I believe, is just a slide with my information if you want more information about anything. So at this point, I will send it back to whoever is running the panelist. Sorry.
No problem, Matthew. Thank you. Okay, so we will now do our second polling question, which is which population or area do you generally work with? TANF, reentry, adult basic education, literacy, English language learners, or digital literacy? Okay, we'll give it a few more seconds. I see some votes are still coming in. Okay, so it looks like ABE is the largest group, but we definitely have a significant TANF presence as well as ELL. So we're appreciative that all of you are here, and we're going to continue moving. And let's see, I will turn this now over to Cheryl Keenan. Cheryl?
Thank you, James, and it's great to be here this afternoon with you all, at least afternoon on the East Coast. And thank you, James, and your colleagues at HHS for focusing needs on low-skilled adults. And that last polling question was a real surprise. So I'm really glad to see that there are a lot of participants here who are directly working with ABE and ESL students, and that they're hopefully this webinar will be helpful to you. Next slide, please. Next slide. Today, I want to focus on basically two main things. First of all, I want to talk a little bit about the Adult Education and Family Literacy Act, which is the federal legislation that's funding the lion's share of adult basic education and ESL services in the United States. But then I also want to really talk a lot more about what some of the new stuff in adult education is and what are some of the emerging trends and interests, particularly relevant to TANF recipients or other individuals who may have lower incomes. So next. slide, please. So what is the Adult Education and Family Literacy Act? You know, when you look back at the history in the United States, we have had federal legislation in some way, shape, or form since the late 1960s, when Congress formally recognized the needs of adults who had educational needs. And over the past 50 years, the federal program has changed significantly, but there is one thing that really hasn't changed and that has remained constant, and that's the recognition of the importance of basic skills and literacy to economic self-sufficiency. So for those in the room that may be historians and actually have seen the first incarnations of Adult Education Act in the United States, you will see that one of the primary purposes, even back then, was to improve the economic self-sufficiency of adults. And that is a trend that has remained strong throughout the years of legislation. So it's not new to try to connect the literacy and educational needs of adults to economic advancement and careers. We have a long history of serving recipients with various forms of public assistance. And so those of you who are in the field or are working with TANF may already have strong connections with the adult education programs in your communities. And over the years, those kinds of relationships have been in place to the extent that oftentimes you can find adult education programs that are specifically tailored to the needs of TANF recipients. But when you look at our current legislative purpose, you know, of course, it is to improve literacy for economic self-sufficiency, but it is also related to families and an adult's ability to be full partners in the educational development of their children, and to obtain secondary school credentials and transition on to beyond that, to post-secondary education and training. There was a point in time in the history of adult education where adult educators felt that if they got someone to a high school diploma, that they had done their job. And that's a landscape that's rapidly changing because of the recognition that it's not the high school diploma should not be a terminal goal of the adult education program, but it is to help people and prepare them to transition to the next step in post-secondary education and training or work. There is also a growing purpose around English language learners improving their proficiency and acquiring an understanding of the American system of government and civic responsibilities. And currently, of the 1.3 million adults that are served in adult education, we're approaching almost 50% of that enrollment is in English literacy programs where people are trying to improve their English language proficiency. So that's a very important point to remember. So right now, the program serves approximately 1.3 million adults. It is a federal, what we refer to as a federal formula grant. That means that my office receives a little bit over, or I should say maybe a little bit under $600 million that we provide to states based on need, and states then must compete those funds out to a variety of different types of organizations, so that when you look across the states, you see that the landscape of who provides adult education varies a lot from state to state, with many different types of providers, including community colleges and school districts and community-based organizations, correctional facilities. And the amount of money that is not federal money that the state puts in also varies widely from state to state. So you have states like California that have almost $500 million in state appropriation alone. So you have states that have a great deal of non-federal money in, and then states who rely, just mainly on the federal money. So it looks differently across the country. And I just give you this context because you may be working locally and it may look one way in your community, but it's important to recognize that that landscape is different in different places. Next slide, please. If we zoom forward to the Adult Education and Family Literacy Act under the new Workforce Innovation and Opportunity Act that was enacted back in 2015, I want to focus a little bit of time on the things that changed in this latest incarnation of our federal legislation. And I want to, there's a lot of things that changed, but what I want to do is to focus on the things that are particularly work-related and work-relevant, because I believe that's where the partnership opportunities are in working to advance the skills of TANF recipients. So this slide gives you some ways that we have changed under the WIOA. And I would say that the first thing is that it has strengthened the ties between services for low-skilled adults and employment. And it's done that in several different ways. One way it has done it is that it has created a stronger tie between the actual funded adult education program and the local workforce boards and America's job centers, which are the career centers across the United States. It did the same thing for adult education as other programs, such as those related to voc rehab, but also that TANF providers are also partners, are required to be partners, particularly at the local level. And you maybe have a lot of experience about that in your locality. One of the other things that I'll talk about in a little bit greater depth is that under this incarnation of the law, 3 new activities were authorized for adult education, meaning that adult education programs can spend their adult education money on different forms of instruction than they could in the past. And this is I think, one of the most significant opportunities that we have, particularly when we're looking at the needs of TANF recipients. Those activities are integrated education and training, workforce preparation, and integrated English literacy and civics education, and I'll expand on that in the next slides. The other piece that I think is so promising is that the legislation across all the workforce programs and the adult education program uses this concept of career pathways as an organizing framework across the workforce system, which is really a framework that looks at advancement of people through work experiences, jobs, and careers that's connected to credentials and a range of things that are emerging as being effective practices. And I'll talk a little bit more about that. But they're the kind of the big changes that have happened that give us kind of more tools in our toolbox when we're trying to meet the needs of people who need stronger attachments to the workforce. Next slide. On this slide, I've tried to lay out what I think are 4 emerging trends in adult education. And these trends are somewhat related to the slide before with the opportunities that are presented in the statute. One is that there is a trend to integrate what's referred to as workforce preparation into the adult education curriculum. Not that we never did employability skills before in adult education, but now it's a little bit more explicit and defined, and I'll talk about that in a minute. The second is, the opportunities to integrate basic skills instruction with occupational skills training, and that is going to be a big focus of this webinar with Will and others who will be talking about particularly about integration of basic skills and occupational skills. You also see a trend that there is an organization of learning that's a little bit different than maybe it was in the past. And that organization of learning opportunities uses things like pathways, career pathways, bridges, on-ramps, and some of those other terms that may be familiar to you. And we also have an emerging trends around how we support learners and learning, with individualized and targeted supports being on the rise, with some support for those types of techniques. So the next slide is on workforce preparation. I'm not going to talk too much about this because I believe that Stacy is going to talk a lot more about one of the most interesting points on this slide, which is digital literacy. But, generally, employability skills have been integrated into ABE curriculum for some time, so this is not new. Adult educators have spent time teaching soft skills, employability skills, higher order thinking skills, self-management skills, along with basic skills, and some have become very adept at it. So what the statute did was it took that concept, renamed it workforce preparation, but honestly, it's a lot of what we know as employability skills, and it defined it in the law. And it said that it's designed to help individuals acquire a combination of basic skills and critical thinking skills and digital literacy skills and self-management skills. I think that, particularly the digital literacy skills is very significant because it really calls out one of the newer employability skills that is much, much needed in our populations in adult education that we're working with. And it creates a definition for that, which I believe Stacy will be sharing with you in a little while. But this, I think, is a very important development in the legislation governing adult education, that there's this formal recognition that basic skills does not necessarily have to be or should be taught in isolation of the kinds of skills that we know are important to the workforce today. Next slide, please. This slide begins the conversation on something really exciting, referred to as integrated education and training. Integrated education and training essentially combines three components into one comprehensive program. It combines basic skills instruction, which is delivered concurrently and in context with workforce prep or employability, and occupational skills training. So this is the first time in adult education that adult educators can actually use adult education funds to pay for occupational skills training if it is delivered in this program that's referred to as IET. That program has to have the purpose of educational and career advancement, and that IET program must be a part of a progressive career pathway, which leads to credentials and advancement opportunities. This, I believe, was modeled, it came out of Congress this way, modeled after the Washington State IBEST model, which I think we know as the seminal model of integration of basic skills and occupational skills. And I won't steal Will's thunder because I think he has some pretty interesting information that he will be sharing as I finish my presentation. I have some basic facts on IET that I can share with you in the next slide. That we began collecting information for the first time and how states are delivering IET programs. And at this point, as of our data collection, which came in on October 1st, approximately 42 states are now funding IET programs to some extent. They're emerging. Some states have small numbers, but the exciting thing is that 42 states are attempting and are establishing options for adult learners that integrate educational and occupational skills training and employability training. The enrollment in those 42 states is trending upwards, and from last year to this year, we saw an 18% increase in those numbers. And I think the real exciting thing is that there is research that is emerging that supports that these approaches of combined or integrating education and training are leading to increased employment and earnings outcomes for participants. So this is, I think, one trend that is a trend to watch. It's a trend to advocate for in your own communities, because I think we have the tools to do it, and we have 42 states who are at some level of implementation. Next slide. Prior to the enactment of WIOA, there was absolutely an emerging trend among states in their adult education programs to try to develop connections to existing career pathway efforts that may have been in existence in the post-secondary world in different states and localities. Because we have such a wide range of educational levels or functioning levels of our participants, some states had advanced connections to career pathways, and some states were working on ways to connect into those existing efforts for individuals that may be at lower skill levels. So these kinds of efforts of trying to support the transition of an adult into different phases of pathways have largely been labeled as bridge courses to post-secondary education, bridges to certain occupational skill areas, on-ramps, and those types of things. But, essentially, they help adult students identify career and education goals and develop skills and content knowledge and learning strategies that they need to enter and succeed in post-secondary education and or employment. So I just kind of wanted to recognize that even with the emergence of this new thing called IET, that there are a lot of wheels in motion in the states where states are developing bridges, on-ramps, pathways, and those kinds of things are still very much in play and providing opportunities to adult learners across the United States. Next slide. The last trend that I want to talk about is individualized and targeted support services. One of the things that WIOA did was it created one definition of career pathways across multiple programs that were probably working under many different definitions in the years prior to enactment. One of the things that I think is so cool is that WIOA created one uniform definition. And if you looked at that definition, you would see that counseling to support an individual achieving his or her educational and career goals is one component of that definition. So it's now a required component of any career pathway. But for those of you who have been working in the TANF world for a long time, you've used case management strategies and probably can't even envision how you would move TANF recipients into self-sufficiency without the wide-scale use of individualized and targeted support services. But be that as it may, states are really embracing the importance of these kinds of support services to adult learners. And now it's a required part of, as I said, of a career pathway. States call them different things. They call them mentors, they call them coaches, they call them career navigators. So you encounter many, many different words. But there is a growing trend among states to fund these kinds of career supports. And there is emerging research to support that these individualized and targeted support services actually are getting positive effects on student outcomes. So another trend, another good direction that our field is going. Next slide. I also wanted to throw in, I wouldn't really say that this is an emerging trend right now, but I think this is also something to watch as something that's on the horizon. We all know that there is a huge interest nationally in expanding apprenticeships within the United States and making more apprenticeship opportunities available to people that provide pathways into good-paying jobs and careers. On the horizon for adult education, there is an interest in developing adult education programs, interest in serving as pre-apprenticeship programs. Pre-apprenticeship programs are designed to prepare individuals for apprenticeships, because what we hear in the field from employers and others who run apprenticeship programs is that there's a shortage of the pipeline of people who are qualified to move into apprenticeships that provide good futures for people. So there is an interest in using adult basic education and ESL programs to do targeted support and instruction for people kind of developing a pipeline into registered apprenticeships and other apprenticeship programs. These programs focus on foundational skills such as math and literacy and career skills. And I think that the bright spot in all of this is that people see these kinds of opportunities as providing significant potential for underrepresented groups and to be able to actually increase the diversity in some of these apprenticeship programs. I think the one shining example of that is in the construction trades and, the effort to get women into the construction trades. But this is an example of an interest to try to increase the diversity within apprenticeships, and for the pre-apprenticeship program to kind of lift up people and prepare them and connect them to apprenticeships that offer wonderful opportunities. So in summary, on the last slide, I would say that just a couple key points before we move on. The takeaway on all of this is that federal policy continues to move towards stronger ties between education and workforce development. Emerging research is supporting that certain services and supports are having positive impacts on employment and earnings outcomes, and that states themselves are adopting policies that support more work-relevant services in adult education. And I know that my colleagues who follow me on this panel will give you much more concrete examples of those kinds of things from different state and research perspectives. So thank you so much for your time, and I look forward to any questions and answers that you may have after our presentation. Thank you.
Thank you, Cheryl. We will now ask the third poll question, which is, what is an example of the literacy level considered basic for adults according to the National Center for Educational Statistics? And we'll give you a few seconds to respond there. Okay, it looks like the overwhelming choice was signing a form. Hopefully that is the right answer. I honestly don't know, but I think you guys are smarter than me. So we'll keep it rolling. and I will turn it over now to William.
All right. Hello, everybody, and good morning or afternoon. It's a pleasure to spend the next little bit of time with you. Thanks for your participation so far. Next slide. Just like Cheryl told you, I'm here to give you some concrete examples of what some of these federal monies and directions look like on the ground. So I'm here to talk to you about IBEST, which you've already heard a little bit about, but I'm going to expand that quite a bit more. You heard about integrated education and training, and that's the federal program. We think of IBEST in Washington State as really a delivery model for kind of how that program can come to life. What does it really look like when it's implemented on the ground? So IET, or Integrated Education and Training, which you learned about from Cheryl, tells us how adult education integrates with career pathways. Integrated Basic Education and Skills Training, or IBEST, is the most well-known and research-verified model for how we can implement IET as a collaboration between workforce education and adult education. And IBEST does meet the criteria for both those IET and career pathway definitions at the federal level. Next slide, please. We've been doing IBEST for about 15 years in Washington State. So actually, as you heard, IBEST helped inform some of the design principles of IET as it became legislated and a model for how adult education funds can be spent. And then as that's been encoded and then promulgated at the federal level, we've continued to refine our model to make sure that we're meeting those requirements and that we're doing the best that we can to, I would say, get the best possible outcomes for participants and get the best possible return on investment for taxpayers. I think that's two sides of the same coin that we really look at our success as how well we do those things. So it is our most successful delivery model for moving so-called underskilled adults to living wage jobs. And IBEST really functions by doing three things particularly well. So I'm going to zero in on each of these things for just a couple minutes because I want to give you a good flavor or a good understanding for what IBEST is and what makes it successful. It transforms the world of adult education through contextualization. That word gets a lot of play, but we're going to talk about what we mean when we talk about it in IBEST. IBEST taps the combined expertise of faculty through integrated team teaching. And then it provides wraparound support and navigational services to promote student retention and completion. Next slide, please. I want to take you to the very beginning of IBEST and kind of how and why it got started in Washington State. So I'm taking you all the way back to 1999. We tracked 35,000 working age adults for 5 years. They were the population that we're speaking of, although some did have a high school credential, but they either, in most cases, did not have a high school credential or were English language learners, and then in some cases had that high school credential, but maybe were coming back to school after a period of time, and were testing as needing remediation in reading, math, etc. So we tracked those adults for 5 years. Next slide, please. To get to the end of the study and tell you what we really learned, we found that the biggest difference in really lifting participants out of poverty was something that we now call the tipping point. And that's when somebody earned a year of college credit and a workforce credential. That's a credential that has labor market value. That might be an industry recognized credential. It might be credentialing done at the state or at the national level. So the credential could be defined by any number of bodies. But the point is that that credential would have actual labor market value and be recognized as demonstrating that a participant has the skills and proficiencies needed to get a job in that area. That year of college is important in Washington State because all of our career technical education in Washington State is 4 credit. You might know, or you'll find out if you do research, that many states have a mix of credit and non-credit workforce programs. So if you're in a state that has non-credit workforce programs, you might solely focus more on the workforce credential. In our state, because all of our career tech programs are 4 credit, that college credit is kind of built into the program design. But the point is that coursework combined with that workforce credential really was the gateway to living wages for the participants who reach that tipping point. Next slide, please. The English language learners in that study who reached the tipping point earned $7,000 more per year on average. With adult basic education, their native-speaking students or students who'd tested out of English language learning reached the tipping point, and they earned even a little bit more, $8,500 more per year on average. And keep in mind that this was many, many years ago, and so those numbers would look different today, but that's what we learned at that time. Next slide, please. Unfortunately, before IBEST, before any interventions, just taking stock of what the situation was at the time, only 5% of those 35,000 working age adults reached the tipping point after 5 years of tracking. For us, that number was unacceptably low, and we really had to look at what could we do different to move significant numbers of students in adult education programs into pathways that led to living wage work. Next slide, please. When we took kind of a sort of a survey or the landscape at the time, what we saw is that we had many levels of adult basic education. Those are kind of represented graphically on the left hand of this image, with a big red dividing line between the levels of adult learning and what it would take to get onto a high demand living wage career pathway. Journeys for English language learners being even longer than what's represented here, with many learners needing one or more quarters and courses to advanced levels. So it can be a really lengthy journey from adult education in the traditional model into a career pathway. You've also got that little box on top that says developmental education. What that means, again, looking at a more traditional setup, is that many students would earn a GED, which was and remains a great goal. But they would go to the college, take a placement test, and still place below college level for areas like reading and math. And so then they would end up in developmental education coursework, which unfortunately had and has similarly kind of dismal outcomes. And so we just saw that we were losing a lot of people in this paradigm and not getting them to their goals. Next slide, please. So the IBEST transformation and really the kind of nifty sleight of hand that we accomplished with this delivery model design is, it's a simple question and answer, really. It's, can we take basic education and teach it at the same time as skills training in a career pathway? That's what IBEST stands for, Integrated Basic Education and Skills Training. And you'll find that the answer is yes. We actually can pair up basic education with skills training and have success. So my key for the slide, I always think alongside, not before. We want to see where we can do adult education alongside skills training in a career pathway, as opposed to before the skills training in a career pathway, because as we learned, for the vast majority of our students, before ultimately meant never. By doing the basic skills before, they never actually got to the skills training. Next slide, please. So a kind of a short, nifty definition of IBEST is that it creates accelerated pathways that allow students to go further and faster in reaching that tipping point of a year of college credit and a workforce credential and beyond. Next slide, please. I'm going to break down the components of IBEST just a little bit more. I've already mentioned these three keys to you, but now they're in a colorful visual, so I'm sure you'll remember them, no problem. Contextualization, team teaching, and navigational support. Let's take about a minute for each of those three components. Next slide. Contextualization, and this is what we mean when we use that word in the IBEST delivery model. Contextualization is what makes basic education relevant for students. Students don't always see the relevance of what we know, the critical things that are being taught in basic education, but when those skills and knowledge, when that's combined and integrated with program outcomes in a career pathway that leads to living wage work, the students aren't as aware that they're really focused on the basic skills. They're learning the basic skills as part of the programming for the career pathway program. So that first circle that says CCRS, those are the college and career readiness standards. They're aligned to the K-12 Common Core, and they're what Washington and many other states use to define the standards for what we are expected to teach our students to be able to know and do. Instead of teaching those in a standalone fashion, we integrate them with the program outcomes. So a student could be in a welding program, a medical assistant program, any number of workforce and even transfer programs, and we will fold in and integrate those writing, those reading, those language and math and digital literacy skills so that they are taught at the same time as the program outcomes in the career pathway. So that's really what makes the basic education relevant for students who are in IBEST pathways. Next slide, please. Okay, team teaching. It's kind of a biggie. It's something that IBEST has had a lot of attention for, and it really is one of the main keys to IBEST success. Team teaching is what brings the tipping point or that goal of that workforce credential within reach for students. What happens is you actually have two instructors teaching the same group of students at the same time in the same classroom. One is the content instructor. I think of that as the career pathway instructor. That's my medical assistant instructor. That's my welding instructor. That's my entrepreneurial, business management instructor. That's whoever that is. The adult education instructor is the expert who comes into the classroom to team teach, and they are experts in teaching reading strategies, writing strategies, math skills, digital literacy skills, and they're teaching those in context to the content. Next slide, please. Oh, you actually get a quick animation that I can explain quickly. It says co-planning, and that's simply indicated that we don't just grab two instructors and throw them into a classroom. There's really a lot of planning and collaboration that takes place between those two instructors to make it successful for students. Okay, next slide, thank you. Finally, those navigational services, which you heard Cheryl mention as well. We see that wraparound support and navigational services keep students in the game and guide them to completion. For many of our students, the biggest barriers to learning aren't actually inside the classroom. I think you know this, they're actually outside the classroom. And so a navigator, and that's the term that we use in Washington State, is there for the student each step on the pathway, moving through intake and advising processes, looking at funding and supportive services, doing strengths-based coaching and keeping students motivated and in the game. The navigator helps with all of those things. I tend to look at the navigator and the two co-teachers really as a team, and it's almost like a three-person team that's really supporting the student through the program. Next slide, please. I also like to say that we wouldn't do IBEST if it didn't work. We would just do the traditional paradigm, but IBEST does work. According to Columbia University's Community College Research Center, which is, I think, one of the premier, if not the premier, research centers for the community college sector in the United States, IBEST students are 3 times more likely to earn college credit than similar students in traditional programming, which is pretty good, but they're 9 times more likely to earn a certificate or degree, again, when compared to similar students in traditional programs. And it's that 9 times more likely to earn a certificate or degree that I kind of hang my hat on. I think that's a key statistic for understanding how IBEST can truly improve the outcomes for participants, and that thus, of course, for the workforce and for our economic development as well. Next slide, please. Okay, I'm winding down with just a little bit of a data piece because I know this can still sound sort of theoretical. What do the numbers really look like? Well, in Washington State, they remain on the smaller side, but very much growing from year to year. You'll see that we've increased enrollment for students from the past 3 years. Unfortunately, my most recent data is not complete because we're still doing year end for the last academic year, but I've seen the numbers in those students enrolled is actually closer to 5,000. So that has kept pace with our growth for the last several years. You can see here a few other key metrics, the degrees and certificates earned, again, with the most recent year much lower simply because we're still compiling year-end data. Our performance points, that says total performance SAI points, those are performance-based funding points that programs earn. It's a little hard for you to have the context for that, but IBEST students actually perform very well in our performance-based funding model, and you'll see that on the next slide as well. So you can see a little bit of a breakdown of the average points per student, and then the federal level gains, which are also very important and more traditional metrics for how students are advancing through the levels of adult basic education as they're going through their career pathway program. Next slide, please. I believe this is my last 1 or 2 slides. I simply want to show you, this is a lot of information on this slide, but if you locate IBEST in the more upper left-hand corner and then scroll all the way across to see total points per student, you'll see that the average IBEST student in our student earns 4.24 points per student. To put that in perspective, you can see that students in our transfer and our workforce and our basic skills programs that aren't in IBEST actually earn many less performance points for funding for programs. And what that shows you is that the incentive is there for programs to offer IBEST for college programs, workforce programs to offer IBEST because the results are so much higher for students. And again, we really attribute that to the three keys of IBEST: contextualization, which makes basic education relevant; team teaching, which brings educational goals within reach for students; and navigators, who provide that high level of wraparound supportive services so that students can stay in the game and make it all the way to that completion point. Next slide, please. The last thing that I'll mention that I think is just important for people to understand how funding can be braided and combined to make these programs cost effective for students. Ability to benefit is legislation passed in 2014 that aligns the definition of career pathways advanced both in the Workforce Innovation and Opportunity Act and now with the latest update of Perkins. And it allows eligible students without a high school credential to apply for federal financial aid. Now, there's a lot of requirements, and I certainly can't overview for them all for you today. But the key there is to understand that students who are working on a high school credential and a career pathway at the same time do have some powerful funding options for them available at the federal level. And we like local programs to know that those funds are out there. Next slide, please. That's all I have from me. Thanks for your patience. And I know this was fast, so I super appreciate questions and dialogue after the fact. Please don't hesitate to contact me if I can be of help in any way. Thank you.
Great. Thank you, William. We will now turn it over to our fourth speaker, Stacy. You're on.
Great, thanks so much. I'm really thrilled that I get a chance to kind of expand a little bit more on digital literacy. And this, I think, will dovetail nicely with everything else that's been talked about digital literacy so far. Next slide. So to start things off, this is the definition of digital literacy that I like. So the ability to use information and communication technologies to find, evaluate, create, and communicate information. And that's requiring both cognitive and technical skills. And I think that's really important, this cognitive piece, because sometimes people think about digital literacy. They think a lot about kind of the where to click, and it's that cognitive piece is important, which we saw in those the test results that were shared earlier. And the reason why Americans do so poorly is that a lot of that has to do with those cognitive skills. And I think it's another thing that's important is that a lot of people, the research has shown that based about everyone thinks that they are more skilled using digital technologies than they actually are. And that's because we tend to conflate kind of use with literacy. So just because somebody can spend all day on their phone does not mean that they actually have a high level of digital literacy. Next slide. This has already been touched upon a lot. So just like kind of more traditional adult literacy, digital literacy instruction works best when it's made relevant to a person's needs. But unfortunately, basically because everyone needs digital literacy now, and that the kind of base level of digital literacy required keeps growing over time, as technology gets more complicated, it can be really difficult to be able to narrow and prioritize what skills people need. And so if you are looking at different potential digital literacy curriculum, there is a lot out there. If you start Googling it, you may not know kind of what training covers what skills and how to choose. Next slide. So just a little brief talk about some research that I did with the city of Seattle. And so we reviewed 15 popular resources, which you can look at our report to find more information about which ones. And what we did is we kind of looked through and did an inventory and identified 74 skills that were covered across these resources and put them into different use buckets. And so those gateway, those are those kind of foundational beginning skills that every single person needs to know. We saw those test results earlier, and it's about like filling out a form as more of kind of an advanced skill, but it's still that would fall under those gateway. And I think that a lot of adult education classes that are tied to employment, they tend to focus more on those workplace skills, but really digital skills are kind of a scaffolding, and they support each other. So next. I'm going to have to kind of fly through this a little bit, but just to give you a sample, these are examples of some of the skills in each of those categories. And so again, those workplace skills, I think, are some of the more traditional ones taught, but then you have these supporting skills like under privacy and security on how to avoid phishing and scams, or, you know, how to, you know, access social services online that are also really important for people who are in adult education programs to know. Next. And so these, I just pulled the sample from curriculum resources that I think are particularly useful for adult education programs to check out. And there are links there that you can go see. I did want to highlight North Star, because this actually came from the Minnesota Literacy Council, and it's been integrated into Minnesota's adult basic education. And anyone can access this free online assessment, and then centers become testing centers and be able to get access to curriculum and certification exams. And next. So digital literacy happens in lots of different places here in the U.S. and similar to where adult literacy education happens. Next. And the big one is public libraries. And I love this statistic that, yes, there are more public libraries in the U.S. than McDonald's, and that digital literacy training happens in just about every single one. Next. And so there's lots of different ways that this training happens in libraries, from actual formal classes, but to actually a lot of places now have this more one-on-one appointment based assistance that's really neat, and sometimes people can even bring in their own devices. So it's like your own little Geek Squad. Next. So I'm just going to highlight a few examples of programs that are using digital literacy across the U.S. And again, you can look at the websites for more info, since I don't have a lot of time. So Literacy Source is here in Seattle, and this is really great. I love their model because they actually put people who are learning English and people who are native English speakers that are also doing some adult basic ed into the same class, and they integrate digital literacy in the class and teach people how to use Google Drive, and they submit all their assignments using Google Drive. And next. ACE the Computer Workforce in Chicago. What I love about this, and they're actually taking the North Star exam on the computers, but they integrate communicating with coworkers and supervisors as part of their workforce skills, which I think is a super important thing that we take for granted, because how we communicate with them is a little different than how we communicate with our friends. And you know, I text with my coworkers now, so things get kind of foggy and so it's good to kind of remind ourselves of the different standards that exist. Next. This Kansas-based organization, I wanted to highlight them because they actually do work with adults receiving TANF, and then they sometimes they're able to get funding from outside, from different resources, and are able to get people computers after the class is done. Next. This program, this partnership that the Community Technology Network did with the city of Sunnydale, California, is great because it was actually taught in Spanish at an elementary school for parents. And it covers really important things like how to be a digital parent. So how to actually communicate with the schools using the online tools, and how to model technology use, and how to protect your kids online. And they also receive a Chromebook after the class. Next. And then another one here in Seattle, the Somali Safety Task Force. And so they primarily work with Somali women, and they partnered with the public library here and offer courses, and they're taught by Somali women, so they're able to kind of go back and forth between English, do different language support. And again, they combine these computer basics, job search, and skills that these women need as mothers to help their kids succeed in school. Next. If you are, I just want to highlight this really important resource that basically I think is relevant to everyone here, that these resources for digital literacy and digital inclusion organizations, which is the National Digital Inclusion Alliance. So they've got guidebooks, information on Discount Internet, and really great knowledge sharing through their listserv and their annual conference. And the next one is in Portland. And so if you, people from all across the U.S. come, but especially if you're in the Pacific Northwest, I hope to see you there. And the next, and so just as kind of my final kind of take-home message as you're looking at integrating digital literacy into programs, is to really keep in mind that different types of digital skills support each other, that scaffolding, and that successful programming integrates these skills in order to help a person achieve their goals. Next. And then here is a direct link to that research that I mentioned, and then you're more than welcome to contact me if you have questions about anything I talked about today or digital literacy in general. Always happy to chat. Thank you.
Stacy, thank you. And thank you to all of our speakers. We are running a little short on time, so I'm going to at least try to get one question to each speaker, and then we will follow up afterwards to make sure all of the questions that have been submitted are answered, and we will include that in our follow-up to you, along with a copy of the webinar PowerPoint and a link to the recording of the webinar. You can also download the PowerPoint now on your control panel in the handouts section. So let's see. We can start with Daphne. On one of your slides, you mentioned splinter skills. Can you explain what those are?
Sure. So splinter skills often refer to uneven skills. So, for example, in vocabulary, if you gave somebody a test of vocabulary words, they seem to get a lot of lower level items wrong, suddenly get a whole bunch of higher level items right, and then get a whole bunch of lower level, next level wrong, and then they get something else right. And so that's one example. Another example is across skills. So perhaps they have, using vocabulary again as an example, they have a 5th grade level of vocabulary, but they have an 8th grade level of decoding. So it basically refers to an unevenness of skills.
Great, thank you. We also got a few requests about some of the data sources and the studies that you referenced in your presentation. So maybe we can provide some information about that in the follow-up. We can touch base with you about that
Sure.
later. Great. Let's see, Cheryl. Are you able to talk about specific sources for emerging research on IET performance and earning outcomes for participants?
So I don't have the specific studies at my fingertips right now. I will say that our Institute for Ed Sciences will be publishing a research synthesis soon that would give all the sources on that. But I don't have those references at my fingertips right now.
Not a problem. We can certainly pass some of that information along with the follow-up once we get it. Let's see, William. One sec here. structure of SBCTC makes basic ed and technical workforce training a natural combination in the setting of a technical community college. What advice would you give to adult ed programs and local K-12 education organizations or community organizations in terms of IETs?
Great question, and I would welcome any follow-up with that individual. We definitely have some structural advantages in Washington State, but one thing I want to say is it's still very much driven by personalities and personal perspectives at the local level. So there's still much work to foster and collaborate in those relationships. It's not quite handed to us, but I do understand that there's greater structural challenges where those systems are less aligned. And so I think the key for adult basic education is to really know your value proposition and to be good at case making so that the person that you're approaching for that partnership really understands you have so much to offer. And I think some messaging work and some thinking about what is the benefit for this program that we would partner with, including the enrollments that we're bringing, including the improved instruction in the classroom, things like that. So that's a very quick answer, and I'd be happy to dialogue with that person more via email.
Great, much appreciated. And Stacy, are you aware of any successful outreach methods that any of the programs that you highlighted used to reach out to their respective communities?
Oh, that's a fantastic question. I know I think it just varies a whole lot. So, for example, the last one with the Small A Safety Task Force, and this is really an existing community and kind of a resource center, and so they were responding to this need that they identified. And I know Literacy Source here in Seattle, so in the kind of a really different scale, Literacy Source does a fantastic job of having partnerships with lots of different organizations, and so they are really well known, so they get referred a whole bunch. And I think that's what I'm not 100% sure, but I think that kind of gets a lot of their foot traffic is from referrals because of their really great partnerships and just communicating and integration in the local community here in Seattle.
Awesome, thank you. I have one more question that I'll just throw out to the group. A person asked, how about assessments? Existing assessments such as CA, SAS are very challenging for the general public, particularly for those that may already need assistance. And as a result, people don't want to take them and don't engage in programs. Are there suggestions for these? Anybody want to take a shot at that?
Sure, this is Daphne. I think in general, testing is very anxiety provoking and can be intimidating. And I've seen some programs actually have really good orientation sessions before they introduce the test that they need to give, so that they do a lot of motivation building. They explain why the tests are given, how everybody will find the test at some point difficult, and that they have to ask difficult questions in order to really specify and learn what the adult needs to know, so that if the test were easy, then nobody would know where to start instruction. So I think the key is doing some one-on-one and maybe group dynamic kind of work on why the tests are given, why they're important, and just really trying to decrease the anxiety around them.
Great, thank you. We appreciate you guys hanging in there with us. Again, we will make sure to follow up with all of the questions to provide responses. So now I'll turn it over to James to close us out.
Thank you, Stephen. We'll just go ahead and move into our final poll question for the day. We'd like to know what topics would you like to see in some of our future webinars? So that'll be our write-in, so we'll give you a few moments to respond to that. And just as a quick reminder, for the sake of time, a transcript and audio recording of this webinar will be available shortly on the PRTA Network website. And you should see that link come up on the screen to you shortly. We'd like to hear from you about future webinars, so please send us your ideas. You can also help us expand our network and reach a greater number of people by directing them, your colleagues, also to the link provided below the bottom of the slide. Thanks again to everyone who participated in today's webinar. And thank you again to our presenters, Daphne, Cheryl, William, and Stacy. Excuse me. We will, as we close out, there will a quick survey will launch to complete today's webinar. That will appear in a separate pop-up window when the webinar ends. Your feedback is important to us, and we like to hear from you about any future webinars, as I said before. So just take a couple of minutes to complete the survey. Thanks again for taking time out of your schedules to join us today. We look forward to your participation in our January webinar on strategies to improve employment outcomes for TANF opioid substance users. Have a wonderful day, and we look forward to hearing from you all in the new year.